Kicked out by my son, I slept under a bridge in a storm. That's when a widowed billionaire rescued me. 15 years ago, I was his parents' cook. He took me in but warned, "Don't enter my daughter's room. She's been depressed since her mom died." He left on a trip. A week later, he returned to find us in the kitchen, covered in flour and singing. What he did next changed everything. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. The rain was coming down so hard I could barely see through the windshield as I pulled into Hugo's driveway. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from what I was about to do. At 62, I'd finally reached my breaking point. I'd been carrying this weight for 15 years, and tonight, I couldn't bear it anymore. Hugo opened the door before I could knock, his face already twisted with that familiar look of irritation. He was 37 now, tall like his father had been, but where David had been gentle, Hugo carried nothing but resentment. "What do you want, Mom?" His voice was flat, emotionless, no greeting, no concern about me driving through this storm. "We need to talk." I stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. The house was a mess. Empty beer bottles on the coffee table, takeout containers scattered everywhere. The place smelled stale, like defeat. Hugo closed the door harder than necessary. "If this is about money again, I already told you. It's not about money." I turned to face him, my heart hammering against my ribs. "It's about the truth. About your father." Something flickered in his eyes. Fear, maybe. "What about Dad?" I'd practiced this conversation 1,000 times in my mind, but standing there, looking at my son's hostile face, the words felt like shards of glass in my throat. "David wasn't your biological father." The silence that followed was deafening. Hugo stared at me like I'd slapped him. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky and the lights flickered. "That's impossible." His voice was barely a whisper. "You're lying." "I'm not lying." I reached into my purse and pulled out the DNA test results I'd been carrying around for 3 months. I had it done. I had to know for sure before I told you. Hugo snatched the papers from my hands, his eyes scanning the clinical language that confirmed what I'd suspected for years. The father listed on his birth certificate, my late husband David, showed 0% probability of paternity. "This is fake." He crumpled the papers. "You made this up." Hugo, please. Who is it then?" His voice was rising, filling with a rage I'd seen building in him for years. "Who's my real father? Some random guy you cheated with?" I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of 15 years of silence pressing down on me. His name was James Barrett. He was my employer's son. I worked as a cook for his family. Hugo's laugh was bitter, cruel. A cook, of course. So my real father is some rich bastard who wouldn't even acknowledge me? It wasn't like that. Then what was it like, Mom? He stepped closer, and I could smell alcohol on his breath. "Tell me exactly how it happened. Tell me how you got pregnant with some rich man's kid, and then lied to Dad about it for his entire life." My throat felt raw. James was 19. I was 32. His parents had just hired me, and he was home from college for the summer. He was kind to me when no one else was. "I was lonely. Your father and I were going through a rough patch, and James, he made me feel seen." "So you had an affair?" "It was one night." The words came out as a whisper. "One stupid night. I regretted it immediately, but then I found out I was pregnant." Hugo was pacing now, running his hands through his hair. "And you never told him?" "Never told me?" "James went back to college. His parents made it clear that I was just the help. When I told them I was quitting, they were relieved. I went home to your father and tried to pretend it never happened. But Dad raised me." Hugo's voice cracked. "He loved me. He did love you. More than anything." Tears were streaming down my face now. David was a good man. The best man I ever knew. He deserved better than my lies. Hugo stopped pacing and stared at me with eyes full of hurt and fury. "You destroyed his life. You made him raise another man's child and never told him the truth." I know. The admission felt like poison in my mouth. "I've carried this guilt every day since he died. That's why I'm telling you now. You have a right to know." "A right to know?" Hugo's voice was getting louder. 15 years after Dad's funeral, you decide I have a right to know? Where was my right to know when I was growing up thinking I had a father who loved me? He did love you. Based on a lie. Hugo slammed his fist against the wall and I flinched. Everything was based on a lie. My entire childhood, my entire identity. It's all fake. I wanted to reach for him, to comfort him the way I used to when he was small and had nightmares. But those days were long gone. Hugo had been pulling away from me for years, ever since David died and left us with nothing but debts and regrets. I'm sorry. It was all I could offer him. I'm so sorry, Hugo. Sorry doesn't fix this. He was shaking now, with anger or shock, I couldn't tell. Sorry doesn't bring Dad back. Sorry doesn't give me back the 15 years I've spent wondering why I never felt like I belonged anywhere. That hit me like a physical blow. What do you mean? I mean, I never looked like him. I never acted like him. I never felt like his son. Not really. Hugo's voice was breaking. And now I know why. Because I'm not his son. I'm the son of some stranger who probably doesn't even remember your name. Hugo, get out. The words were quiet, but they hit me harder than if he'd screamed them. What? Get out of my house. He wouldn't look at me anymore. I don't want to see you again. You don't mean that. I mean every word. He finally met my eyes, and what I saw there made my blood turn to ice. You've been lying to me my entire life. You let me worship a dead man who wasn't even my father. You destroyed any chance I had of knowing my real family. Please, let's talk about this. There's nothing to talk about. You made your choice 37 years ago when you decided to build my life on a lie. Now live with it. He walked to the front door and opened it. The storm was getting worse, rain lashing against the porch. Hugo, I have nowhere else to go. That's not my problem anymore. His voice was ice cold. You're not my mother. We're not family. We never were. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stood there for a moment, hoping he'd take it back, hoping to see some trace of the little boy who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms. But that little boy was gone. Had been gone for years. I walked to the door on unsteady legs. I love you, I whispered. Hugo didn't respond. He just closed the door behind me and I heard the deadbolt slide into place. The storm was raging now, the wind so strong I could barely stay upright. My car wouldn't start. The engine just wheezed and died. I tried calling a cab, but my phone had no signal. I started walking. By the time I reached the bridge on Riverside Drive, I was soaked through and shivering uncontrollably. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the concrete pathway underneath the overpass. The rain pounded down around me, and I pulled my thin jacket tighter, knowing it was useless. This was how I was going to die, alone, under a bridge, rejected by the only family I had left. I must have passed out, because the next thing I remember was a man's voice cutting through the storm. Ma'am? Ma'am, can you hear me? I opened my eyes to see a figure kneeling beside me, rain streaming down his face. He was maybe 50, with silver gray hair and concerned brown eyes. We need to get you out of this weather, he said gently. Can you walk? I tried to speak, but only managed a croak. He helped me to my feet, supporting my weight as we made our way to a sleek black car parked nearby. I'm taking you somewhere warm, he said as he helped me into the passenger seat. My name is Barrett. What's yours? Barrett. Through my haze of cold and exhaustion, that name sent a jolt through my system. But it couldn't be. Not after all these years. Marion, I whispered. If the name meant anything to him, he didn't show it. He just nodded and started the engine. As we drove through the storm-dark streets, I stared at his profile in the dashboard light. The boy I'd known 15 years ago had become a man, successful by the look of his car and clothes. And he had no idea that the woman he was rescuing had given birth to his son. Barrett's house was nothing like I remembered. 15 years ago, the Barrett estate had been impressive but dated. All dark wood and heavy furniture that spoke of old money and older traditions. Now, as Barrett guided me through the front door, I saw gleaming marble floors, modern artwork, and floor-to-ceiling windows that would offer stunning views of the city once the storm passed. Let me get you some dry clothes, Barrett said, his voice gentle but professional. The way someone might speak to a stray animal they'd found in the rain. I stood dripping in his pristine foyer, feeling like an intruder. Water pooled at my feet on the expensive marble, and I wanted to disappear into the floor. I should go, I managed to say through chattering teeth. I don't want to impose. Nonsense. Barrett was already heading toward a hallway. You're hypothermic. We need to get your body temperature up before we worry about anything else. He returned with a stack of clothes, soft sweatpants, a thick sweater, warm socks, women's clothes. These were my wife's, he said quietly, and something in his tone made me look up at him sharply. Past tense. She was about your size. The bathroom is just down the hall. As I changed into the warm, dry clothes, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. The woman staring back looked older than 62, worn down by years of worry and tonight's trauma. My gray hair hung in wet strings around my face, and my eyes were red-rimmed from crying. This wasn't how I'd imagined seeing Barrett again. When I emerged from the bathroom, he had coffee waiting. Real coffee, not the instant stuff I'd been living on since David died. The warmth of the mug between my hands made me want to cry all over again. Better? Barrett asked, settling into the chair across from me in what I assumed was his living room. Everything was pristine, expensive, and somehow empty. Thank you. I took a sip of the coffee and felt it warm me from the inside out. I don't know how to repay you for this. You don't need to repay anything. Barrett studied my face, and for a moment I wondered if recognition was dawning, but then he looked away. What happened tonight? Why were you out in the storm? The question I'd been dreading. How do you explain to a stranger that your life has just fallen apart? That the son you've sacrificed everything for has cut you out of his life? Family troubles, I said finally. It wasn't a lie, just not the whole truth. Barrett nodded slowly. I understand family troubles. Something in his voice made me look up at him again. He was staring at his coffee cup, his jaw tight with some kind of pain. Do you have family? I asked. A daughter. The words came out strained. Emma. She's 17. The age hit me like a punch to the stomach. Hugo was 37. If Barrett had a 17-year-old daughter, she's been having a hard time since her mother died, Barrett continued, seemingly unaware of my shock. 6 months ago, car accident. I'm sorry for your loss. The condolences felt inadequate, but what else could I say? Emma blames herself. They had a fight that morning before it happened. She hasn't spoken more than a few words to me since the funeral. Barrett looked up at me with eyes full of exhaustion. I've tried everything. Therapists, support groups, medication. Nothing helps. I wanted to tell him that grief had its own timeline, that pushing wouldn't help. But I wasn't his friend or his counselor. I was just a woman he'd rescued from a storm. It's late, Barrett said, glancing at his watch. You can stay in the guest room tonight, and tomorrow we'll figure out your situation. I can't. You can, and you will. His tone was firm, but not unkind. It's not safe for you to go anywhere tonight. As Barrett led me up a sweeping staircase, I found myself studying the layout of the house. The hallway was different. Walls had been removed, creating an open flow that hadn't existed 15 years ago. But the bones of the house were the same. I'd spent 6 months working in the kitchen below, preparing meals for Barrett's parents while he was away at college. James Barrett Sr. had been a demanding man, particular about his food and dismissive of the staff. His wife had been kinder but distant, treating me like a piece of furniture that happened to be useful. And then Barrett, James Jr., had come home for summer break. He'd been 19 then, all sandy hair and easy smiles. Unlike his parents, he'd actually talked to me, asked about my life, my opinions on books he was reading for his literature classes. He'd made me feel intelligent, valued, seen in a way David never had. One night, when his parents were at some charity gala, Barrett had found me crying in the kitchen. David and I had been fighting constantly then, about money, about his drinking, about the distance growing between us. Barrett had listened, really listened, and then somehow we were talking until dawn about everything and nothing. That was the night Hugo was conceived. This is the guest room, Barrett said, opening a door at the end of the hall. There's an attached bathroom, and you should find everything you need. The room was beautiful, decorated in soft blues and whites, with a window that would overlook the gardens in daylight. But my attention was drawn to the closed door across the hall. "That's Emma's room," Barrett said, following my gaze. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "She doesn't like to be disturbed. I'd appreciate it if you could respect that." I nodded, but something in his tone made me study his face more carefully. This wasn't just a father being protective. There was fear there, desperation. "She's struggling that badly?" Barrett's shoulders sagged. "She hasn't eaten a full meal in weeks, hasn't left her room except for school, and even that's becoming irregular. The therapist says she's showing signs of severe depression, but Emma won't talk to anyone." My heart ached for both of them. I'd watched Hugo struggle with his identity for years, but at least he'd been willing to fight, to rage, to feel something. A teenager who'd stopped feeling anything was infinitely more frightening. "I should let you get some rest," Barrett said. "There are extra blankets in the closet if you get cold." After he left, I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process everything that had happened. 6 hours ago, I'd been preparing to tell my son the truth about his parentage. Now I was sleeping in the house of his biological father, who didn't recognize me and was dealing with his own family crisis. The universe had a cruel sense of irony. I was about to turn off the lamp when I heard it, a soft crying coming from across the hall. Emma. The sound was heartbreaking, full of the kind of pain that only comes from losing someone you love. I knew that sound. I'd made it myself the night David died, and again tonight when Hugo turned his back on me. Barrett had asked me not to disturb her, but every maternal instinct I had was screaming at me to go to her. This was exactly the kind of situation where I'd always failed Hugo, respecting boundaries instead of pushing through them, being polite instead of being present. But Emma wasn't my daughter. I was a stranger in this house, dependent on Barrett's kindness for shelter. The last thing I should do was overstep. The crying continued, and I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block it out. But the sound seemed to seep through the walls, through my defenses, straight into the part of my heart that had always been too soft for my own good. Tomorrow, Barrett would probably drive me to a shelter or help me find a room somewhere. Tonight might be my only chance to help Emma in a way I'd never been able to help Hugo. I was still debating with myself when the crying suddenly stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that somehow felt worse than the tears. That decided it. I stood up and crossed the hall, my heart pounding as I raised my hand to knock on Emma's door. But something made me pause, my fist frozen in midair. What if I was wrong? What if trying to help Emma only made things worse? What if Barrett found out and threw me back into the storm? But then I thought about Hugo's face when he told me to leave, about the years of distance and resentment that had built up between us because I'd always chosen safety over connection. I couldn't make the same mistake again. I knocked softly on Emma's door, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Go away, Dad." The voice was hoarse, exhausted. "It's not your father," I said quietly. "It's Marion, the woman he brought home tonight." Silence. Then, after what felt like an eternity, footsteps. The door opened a crack, revealing one brown eye surrounded by tangled dark hair. "What do you want?" Emma's voice was flat, emotionless. "I heard you crying. I thought maybe you could use some company." Emma studied me for a long moment, taking in the borrowed clothes, my still damp hair. "You're the lady he found in the storm." "That's right." I kept my voice gentle, non-threatening. Sometimes it helps to talk to someone who's not family, someone who doesn't have expectations. Another pause. Then the door opened wider, revealing a girl who looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. Emma was tall like her father, with his dark hair and serious eyes. But where Barrett carried himself with confidence, Emma seemed to be folding in on herself, trying to disappear. "I guess you can come in," she said reluctantly. Emma's room was a shrine to a life interrupted. Dance trophies lined the shelves, photographs showed a happier girl with friends and family, and a violin sat abandoned in its case in the corner. But everything was covered with a fine layer of dust, as if Emma had stopped touching any of it months ago. She sat on her unmade bed, pulling her knees up to her chest. "Dad probably told you I'm crazy. He told me you're grieving. That's not the same thing." Emma let out a bitter laugh. Everyone keeps saying that. Like grief is some normal thing that has stages and timelines. Like if I just follow the right steps, I'll be okay again. I settled into the chair at her desk, careful not to disturb the homework that had been sitting there for who knows how long. What do you think? I think some things can't be fixed. Emma's voice was barely a whisper. I think some mistakes are too big to forgive. The pain in her voice was so familiar it made my chest ache. What mistake? Emma was quiet for so long I thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, the words came out in a rush, like she'd been holding them in for months. We fought that morning, about college. Mom wanted me to apply to Juilliard for violin, but I wanted to study veterinary medicine. She said I was wasting my talent, that I didn't understand how rare it was to have the kind of musical ability I had. Emma paused, wiping her nose on her sleeve. I told her I hated the violin. I told her I only played because she forced me to, and that I was done pretending to be someone I wasn't just to make her happy. I could see where this was going, and my heart broke for this girl who was carrying the weight of words that could never be taken back. She left angry, Emma continued. She was supposed to pick me up from school that afternoon, but she texted saying she needed space to think. She was driving to her sister's house when the truck ran the red light. The silence that followed was heavy with pain and guilt, and all the things that couldn't be undone. You know it wasn't your fault, I said finally. Everyone says that. Emma's voice was sharp with frustration. But you weren't there. You didn't see her face when I said I hated something she loved. You didn't see how hurt she was. No, I wasn't there. But I know what it's like to carry guilt that feels too heavy to bear. Emma looked up at me for the first time since I'd entered the room. What do you mean? I thought about Hugo's face when I told him the truth about his father, about the 37 years of lies that had culminated in him throwing me out of his life, about all the ways I'd failed as a mother. I have a son, I said slowly. Had a son. Tonight I told him something I should have told him years ago, and he decided he never wants to see me again. What did you tell him? The question was so direct, so unexpected, that I almost answered honestly. But Emma was a child, and this wasn't her burden to carry. Something about his father. Something that changed how he saw his whole life. I met her eyes. The thing is, I thought I was protecting him by keeping it secret. But secrets have a way of becoming poison. Emma was studying my face intently. Do you regret telling him? I regret waiting so long to tell him. I regret all the years we lost because I was afraid of the truth. But at least you tried to fix it. At least you were brave enough to tell him. Emma's voice cracked. I can't fix anything. I can't take back what I said. I can't tell my mom I'm sorry. I can't tell her that I didn't mean it, that I was just scared about disappointing her. I wanted to reach out and hug this broken girl, but I sensed that physical comfort might shatter whatever fragile trust we were building. Your mother knew you loved her, I said instead. Mothers always know, even when kids say terrible things in anger. How can you be so sure? Because I was a mother who heard terrible things said in anger, and I never doubted that my son loved me, even when he was saying he hated me. Emma considered this, and I could see her trying to decide whether to believe me. What happened to your husband? Emma's father? The change of subject caught me off guard. He died, 6 years ago. Heart attack. Do you miss him? The question was loaded with more meaning than Emma probably realized. Did I miss David? The man who'd raised Hugo as his own son, who'd never questioned whether Hugo was really his, the man who'd loved me despite my secrets. Every day, I said truthfully. But missing someone isn't the same as regretting the life you had with them. I keep thinking about all the things I should have said differently, all the ways I could have been a better daughter. And I keep thinking about all the ways I could have been a better mother. But thinking about it doesn't change anything. At some point, you have to decide whether you're going to let the guilt destroy you or whether you're going to find a way to honor the person you lost. Emma was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was small, uncertain. How do you honor someone when you can't apologize to them? Maybe by becoming the person they always believed you could be. Maybe by living the life they wanted for you, even if it's different from what they expected. Mom wanted me to be a musician. But what do you want? Emma smiled for the first time since I'd entered her room. It was small and sad, but it was real. I want to help animals. I've wanted to be a veterinarian since I was 8 years old. Then maybe honoring your mother means having the courage to pursue that dream, even if it's not what she would have chosen for you. We talked until nearly 3 in the morning. Emma told me about her mother, a former concert pianist who'd given up her career to raise Emma and support Barrett's business. She told me about the pressure she felt to be perfect, to make up for her mother's sacrifices. She told me about the friends who'd stopped calling after the funeral because they didn't know what to say. In return, I told her about Hugo's childhood, about the challenges of raising a son alone after David died. I told her about the loneliness of being a widow, about the fear of making decisions without a partner to lean on. I didn't tell her about Hugo's parentage. That secret was still too raw, too complicated. When Emma finally started yawning, I stood to leave. "Thank you for letting me in," I said. "Sometimes we all need someone to listen. Will you still be here tomorrow?" The question was casual, but I could hear the hope underneath it. "I don't know. That's up to your father." Emma nodded, but something in her expression had shifted. She looked less defeated, more thoughtful. "Marion? Do you know how to cook?" The question surprised me. "Yes. Why?" "Mom used to make these amazing blueberry pancakes. Dad's tried to recreate them a few times, but they never taste right. I haven't had a real breakfast in months." My heart squeezed. "I'd be happy to make you breakfast if your father doesn't mind." "He won't mind. He's been trying to get me to eat more for weeks." After I left Emma's room, I lay awake in the guest bed thinking about the conversation. Emma reminded me of myself at her age, trying so hard to be what everyone expected, terrified of disappointing the people she loved. But she also reminded me of Barrett at 19, that same earnestness, that same desire to do the right thing, even when it was difficult. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Barrett moving around downstairs. When I came down to the kitchen, I found him standing at the coffee maker in a suit that probably cost more than I used to make in a month. "Good morning," he said, looking surprised to see me. "I hope you slept well." "I did. Thank you again for your hospitality." I paused, then decided to be direct. "I talked to Emma last night." Barrett's entire body went rigid. "What do you mean you talked to her?" "She was crying. I knocked on her door and she let me in. We talked for a few hours. I specifically asked you not to disturb her." Barrett's voice was cold, professional. The same tone his father used to use with the staff. "I know, and I'm sorry for overstepping, but she needed someone to listen, and sometimes it's easier to talk to a stranger." Barrett set down his coffee cup with more force than necessary. "Emma is my daughter. Her care is my responsibility." "Of course it is. I wasn't trying to overstep your authority as her father. I was just trying to help a young woman who's in pain. And you think you know what's best for her based on one conversation?" The accusation stung because it was partially true. I had overstepped. I had made assumptions. But I'd also seen something in Emma that Barrett seemed to be missing. "I think she needs to know that it's okay to grieve in her own way," I said carefully. "And I think she needs to know that her mother's death wasn't her fault." The therapist has told her that repeatedly. Sometimes kids need to hear it from someone who isn't being paid to say it. Barrett stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him struggling between anger and something else. Hope, maybe. "Did she actually talk to you?" "More than a few words. She told me about the fight she had with her mother, about her guilt over the things she said." I paused. "She also told me she wants to be a veterinarian." Something shifted in Barrett's expression. "She hasn't mentioned that career interest in months. Maybe she thought you wouldn't approve. Maybe she thought she had to follow in her mother's footsteps." Barrett was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. "What else did she say?" "She asked if I could make her breakfast. She mentioned that her mother used to make blueberry pancakes." I watched Barrett's face carefully and saw the exact moment when hope won out over caution. "She hasn't asked for anything in months," he said quietly. "She's barely been eating. Would you mind if I cooked for her? For both of you?" Barrett hesitated, then nodded. "I have to leave for a business trip this afternoon. I'll be gone for 5 days. The statement hung between us, loaded with implications. He was considering leaving me alone with Emma, a stranger he'd found under a bridge. "I know how this looks," I said. "I know you don't know anything about me, but I promise you, I would never hurt your daughter." Barrett studied my face for a long moment. "Emma has refused to stay with anyone since her mother died. She won't go to her aunt's house, won't accept help from any of our family friends. But if she's willing to talk to you, you don't have to decide right now. Let me make breakfast first, see how she responds." Barrett nodded slowly. "All right, but Marion? If I come back and she's worse instead of better, this arrangement ends immediately." I understood the threat behind his words, and I respected it. But I also knew something he didn't. That Emma was ready to start healing. She just needed someone to show her how. What Barrett couldn't have known was that helping his daughter might be the key to healing myself. Barrett was supposed to return from his business trip on Friday evening. Instead, he walked through the front door at 3 in the afternoon, his face drawn with exhaustion and something else. Concern. I was in the kitchen with Emma, flour dusting our clothes as we worked on a batch of chocolate chip cookies. It was the 4th day of Barrett's absence, and Emma had eaten 3 full meals each day. She'd even smiled that morning when I'd accidentally dropped an entire egg on the floor. "Dad?" Emma looked up from the mixing bowl, surprised but not displeased. "You're home early." Barrett's eyes moved from his daughter to me, taking in the scene. The kitchen was a comfortable mess. Ingredients scattered across the counter, mixing bowls in the sink, the warm smell of baking cookies filling the air. "I finished the meetings ahead of schedule," he said, but I could tell that wasn't the whole truth. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Emma actually smiled. "Good. Marion's been teaching me how to make real cookies, not the kind from a tube." "I can see that." Barrett's voice was carefully neutral, but his eyes kept returning to me. Something was wrong. "Why don't you go wash up?" I suggested to Emma. "We can finish the cookies after you change clothes." Emma nodded and headed upstairs, leaving Barrett and me alone in the kitchen. The comfortable atmosphere from moments before suddenly felt charged with tension. "We need to talk," Barrett said quietly. My stomach dropped. "Of course." Barrett walked to the kitchen island and leaned against it, putting distance between us. "I've been doing some thinking while I was away. About you. About the situation. I busied myself with cleaning the counter, needing something to do with my hands." "What kind of thinking?" "The kind where I try to figure out who you really are." Barrett's voice was measured, controlled. "You show up in my life during a storm. You connect with my daughter in ways no one else has been able to, and you clearly know your way around a kitchen." I kept cleaning, not trusting myself to speak. "So I made some calls. Did some research." Barrett paused. "Marion Davies, 62 years old, widowed 6 years ago. Used to work as a cook for various families in the area." The cloth in my hands went still. Davies had been David's name, the name I'd taken when we married. But if Barrett was looking into my work history, including the Barrett family, 15 years ago. The words hung in the air between us like a confession. I finally looked up and met his eyes, seeing recognition there, and something else. Suspicion? Anger? I couldn't tell. "You knew," Barrett said. It wasn't a question. I knew. My voice came out as a whisper. "When you saw this house, when I told you my name, you knew exactly who I was." I nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in my throat. Barrett ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I remembered from when he was 19. "So what is this? Some kind of con? Are you here for money?" "No." The word came out sharp, defensive. "I would never— This isn't about money." "Then what is it about?" Barrett's voice was rising slightly. "You show up out of nowhere, insert yourself into my family, gain my daughter's trust. For what? What do you want from me?" I set down the cloth with trembling hands. This wasn't how I'd imagined this conversation happening. I'd thought I'd have more time, that maybe Barrett would never need to know the truth. "I need to tell you something," I said quietly, "about why I left your family's employment 15 years ago." Barrett's expression hardened. I'm listening. I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. Your son that I mentioned last night. Hugo. He's 37 years old. Barrett frowned, clearly not understanding the relevance. What does your son have to do with... He was born 9 months after I stopped working for your parents. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched Barrett's face as the math clicked into place, as understanding dawned. No. The word was barely audible. I never meant for it to happen. You were home from college for the summer, and your parents were gone so much, and I was having problems with my marriage. No. Barrett was shaking his head, backing away from me. That's impossible. I reached into my purse and pulled out the same DNA test results I'd shown Hugo. My hands were shaking as I held them out to Barrett. I had the test done 3 months ago. I needed to be sure before I told Hugo the truth. Barrett stared at the papers like they were a snake coiled to strike. Hugo is my son, yes, and you never told me. You let me go on with my life, never knowing I had a son. The pain in his voice cut through me like a blade. I wanted to tell you, but your parents made it clear that I was just the help. When I quit, they were relieved. You were 20 years old, starting your life. I was 32 and married. It seemed better for everyone if I just disappeared. Better for everyone? Barrett's voice was incredulous. You decided what was better for everyone? You decided I didn't have a right to know I had a son? You were just a kid yourself. I was an adult. Barrett slammed his hand against the counter, making me jump. I was old enough to make my own decisions about my own child. The accusation hit me like a physical blow because it was true. I had made the decision for him, just like I'd made the decision to lie to David, just like I'd made so many decisions based on fear instead of courage. You're right, I said quietly. I made choices that weren't mine to make. I was scared and young, and I thought I was protecting everyone. Protecting everyone. Barrett laughed bitterly. You protected everyone except the child you kept from knowing his real father. I thought about Hugo's face when I'd told him the truth, about the way he'd looked at me like I was a stranger. Hugo hates me now. When I told him about you, he threw me out of his life. Good for him. The words hit me like a slap. Barrett, don't. Barrett held up a hand, his face pale with shock and anger. Don't say my name like we're friends, like you have any right to familiarity after what you've done. I wanted to explain about the pressure from his parents, about the fear of scandal, about the way his father had looked at me when I'd given my notice, like I was something distasteful that needed to be disposed of quickly and quietly, but none of those excuses would change what I'd done. None of them would give Barrett back the 37 years he'd lost with his son. Where is he now? Barrett's voice was hoarse. Hugo, where does he live? About 20 minutes from here. But Barrett, you should know that he's not. He's struggled. With identity, with anger. Learning about you might not go the way you hope. That's my decision to make, isn't it? Barrett's eyes were cold. Or are you going to take that choice away from me too? Before I could respond, Emma's voice drifted down from upstairs. Marion, are the cookies ready? Barrett and I looked at each other, both of us remembering that we had an audience for this conversation. Emma, who'd been making progress for the first time in months. Emma, who had no idea that the woman she'd been confiding in had been keeping a secret that would change her family forever. She can't know, Barrett said quietly. Not yet. Not until I figure out what to do about this. I nodded, understanding. What do you want me to do? Barrett stared at me for a long moment, his jaw working as he struggled with emotions I could only imagine. I want you to pack your things and leave. Tonight. The words felt like a death sentence. But Emma will be fine. She was doing better before you came, and she'll continue to improve after you're gone. I wanted to argue, to point out that Emma hadn't eaten a full meal in weeks before I arrived, that she'd been talking about her mother for the first time since the accident. But I had no right to argue. I'd lost that right the moment I'd decided to keep Barrett's son from him. Can I at least say goodbye to her? Explain why I'm leaving? Barrett considered this. You can tell her that you found other arrangements, that your time here was always temporary. It wasn't the truth, but it wasn't exactly a lie either. My time here had been temporary. I'd just hoped it might last longer than 5 days. Marion? Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking between her father and me with growing concern. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine, sweetheart." Barrett's voice was carefully controlled. "Marion was just telling me that she's found a more permanent place to stay." Emma's face fell. "You're leaving?" I forced myself to smile. "I am, but you've made such wonderful progress this week. Your father is so proud of you." "But I thought you might stay longer. We were going to work on Mom's blueberry pancake recipe tomorrow." My heart broke, looking at Emma's disappointed face. She'd finally started to open up, to heal, and now I was abandoning her just like everyone else in her life seemed to do. "I'll write down the recipe for you," I said gently, "and you can call me if you need help with it." Emma looked at her father, clearly sensing the tension between us. "Did I do something wrong?" "No, sweetheart. You've been perfect." Barrett's voice softened when he spoke to his daughter. "Sometimes adult situations are complicated in ways that don't have anything to do with you." Emma nodded, but I could see the walls going back up behind her eyes. The progress we'd made over the past 5 days was already starting to erode. An hour later, I was packed and waiting by the front door for the cab Barrett had called. Emma had hugged me goodbye, a real hug, fierce and desperate, before disappearing back to her room. "Marion." Barrett's voice stopped me as I reached for the door handle. I turned to face him, hoping against hope that he'd changed his mind. "I need Hugo's address." Of course. He wasn't trying to reconcile with me. He was trying to figure out how to contact the son he'd never known he had. I wrote down Hugo's information on a piece of paper and handed it to Barrett. Our fingers brushed as he took it, and for just a moment I saw the boy I'd known 15 years ago. Confused, hurt, trying to do the right thing in an impossible situation. "For what it's worth," I said quietly. "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't change anything, but I want you to know that I regret how I handled this. All of it." Barrett looked at the paper in his hands, then back at me. "I don't know if I can forgive you for this, but I understand why you did it. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't complete condemnation either. It was more than I deserved." The cab honked outside, and I picked up my small suitcase, the same one I'd been carrying when Barrett found me under the bridge 5 days ago. "Take care of Emma," I said. "She's stronger than she thinks she is." Barrett nodded, but he didn't say goodbye. He just watched from the doorway as I walked to the cab, climbing in with no idea where I was going or what I was going to do next. As we drove away, I looked back to see Barrett still standing in the doorway, Hugo's address clutched in his hand. In a few hours, he would probably drive to his son's house and introduce himself. Hugo would learn that the father he'd been wondering about was a successful businessman who lived 20 minutes away. Barrett would learn that he had a son who was angry, bitter, and wanted nothing to do with family. And I would be alone again, having lost both of them in the space of a week. But at least the truth was finally out. At least Barrett and Hugo would have the chance to know each other, even if that chance had come 37 years too late. 3 weeks had passed since I'd left Barrett's house, and I was living in a small efficiency apartment on the other side of town. The place was clean, but sparse. A bed, a tiny kitchenette, a single window that looked out onto a parking lot. It was nothing like the comfortable guest room I'd briefly called home, but it was mine. I'd found a job at a local diner, working the morning shift. The pay was barely enough to cover rent and groceries, but it kept me busy and gave me a reason to get up each day. The other waitresses were kind enough, though they probably wondered what a woman my age was doing starting over from scratch. I tried not to think about Barrett and Emma, but it was impossible. Every morning when I made my coffee, I wondered if Emma was eating breakfast. Every evening when I came home to my empty apartment, I wondered if she was still talking to her father or if she'd retreated back into silence. I especially tried not to think about Hugo, but that was even harder. Had Barrett contacted him? Had they met? The possibilities kept me awake at night, staring at the ceiling and imagining conversations I'd never be part of. That's why I was so surprised when my phone rang on a Tuesday evening, and Barrett's name appeared on the screen. I stared at it for 3 rings before answering. "Hello?" "Marion." Barrett's voice was tired, strained. "I need to talk to you." My heart started racing. "Is Emma okay?" Emma's fine. This is about Hugo. I sat down heavily on my small couch. You contacted him. I went to his house last Saturday. He wasn't exactly receptive. I could imagine. Hugo had been volatile even before learning about his parentage. Finding out he had a father he'd never known probably hadn't improved his disposition. What happened? Barrett was quiet for a moment. He told me exactly what he thought of mothers who keep secrets and fathers who abandon their children. Then he slammed the door in my face. I'm sorry. I should have warned you that he's been angry for a long time. Learning about you just gave him a new target. That's not why I'm calling. Barrett's voice was carefully controlled. I'm calling because of what he said before he slammed the door. I waited, my chest tight with apprehension. He said that if I really wanted to know what kind of woman you are, I should ask you about the night he was arrested. My blood turned to ice. Hugo had promised never to tell anyone about that night. It had been 3 years ago, and we'd agreed it would stay between us. Marion? Barrett's voice was gentle now, concerned. What happened the night Hugo was arrested? I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of another secret pressing down on me. It's complicated. I have time. I took a deep breath, trying to figure out where to start. 3 years ago, Hugo was going through a particularly bad period. He'd lost his job, was drinking too much, getting into fights. He called me one night, drunk and angry, saying he was going to do something stupid. I paused, remembering the terror I'd felt hearing Hugo's voice that night, slurred with alcohol and thick with desperation. I drove to his apartment and found him loading David's old hunting rifle. He said he was going to rob a convenience store, that he was tired of being broke and powerless. Barrett's sharp intake of breath carried over the phone line. I tried to talk him out of it, but he was beyond reasoning, so I made a choice. My voice cracked slightly. I told him that if he was determined to rob someone, he should rob me instead. You what? I emptied my bank account, about $3,000, and gave it to him. I told him it was all I had, that if he needed money that badly, he could take it from me instead of risking his life and freedom. And that worked? For about 20 minutes. Then he sobered up enough to realize what had happened, what he'd almost done. He called the police on himself. Barrett was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, he said, he called the police on himself? He said he couldn't live with knowing he'd robbed his own mother, even if I'd given him permission. So he confessed to attempted armed robbery and turned himself in. But you gave him the money willingly. Try explaining that to a 22-year-old police officer. They arrested Hugo for attempted robbery, and they arrested me as an accessory because I'd enabled the crime by providing the money. I could hear Barrett processing this information. What happened? We spent the night in jail. The charges were eventually dropped. The DA said it was too complicated to prosecute and no actual crime had been committed. But Hugo never forgave himself. Or me. He blamed you for his arrest? He blamed me for letting him get to that point. He said if I'd been a better mother, if I'd taught him better coping skills, he never would have considered robbery in the first place. I laughed bitterly. He wasn't wrong. Marion, that's not... The point is, I interrupted, Hugo has been carrying that shame for 3 years. Learning about you, about the lies I told, just confirmed what he already believed about me, that I'm someone who makes bad choices and hurts the people she loves. Barrett was quiet again. When he spoke, his voice was softer than I'd heard it since he'd discovered the truth about Hugo. The night I found you under the bridge. You said you had family troubles. Hugo had just kicked me out. I'd finally told him about you, and he decided he was done with me. So when I brought you to my house, you were homeless. Yes, the admission was embarrassing, but there was no point in lying anymore. And you knew who I was, but you didn't say anything because you didn't want to complicate my life. I didn't say anything because I was a coward, because I knew that if you found out the truth you'd hate me, just like Hugo does. Another long pause. Emma has been asking about you. The change of subject caught me off guard. What? Every day since you left. She wants to know if you're okay, where you're living, if you're eating enough. Barrett's voice carried a note of exhaustion. She made me promise to check on you. My heart ached thinking about Emma worrying about me. Is she doing okay? Is she still eating? She's doing better than she was, but not as well as she was when you were here. She's been cooking some of the recipes you taught her, but she won't eat much of what she makes. She needs time. Grief isn't linear. I know. Her therapist says the same thing. Barrett paused. She also says that Emma formed an attachment to you that was healthy and important for her healing process. I wasn't sure where Barrett was going with this conversation. What are you saying? I'm saying that maybe I was hasty in asking you to leave. Maybe I let my anger about the past cloud my judgment about what was best for Emma. Hope fluttered in my chest, but I tried to keep it in check. Barrett, I understand why you don't trust me. I've given you every reason not to. You have. But I've had 3 weeks to think about it, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion. Which is, you made a mistake 38 years ago. A big mistake that hurt people and had lasting consequences. But you're not a bad person, Marion. You're someone who's been trying to protect the people you love, even when you've gone about it the wrong way. Tears were gathering in my eyes. I never meant to hurt anyone. I know, and I think Hugo knows it too, deep down. He's just too angry right now to admit it. So what happens now? Barrett was quiet for a moment, and I could hear voices in the background, Emma calling something to her father. Now I ask if you'd be willing to come back, not as a temporary guest, but as someone who cares about Emma and wants to help her heal. What about Hugo? He's your son too. He has a right to a relationship with you. Hugo will come around when he's ready, or he won't, but I can't put my relationship with Emma on hold while I wait for him to work through his anger. I thought about my small apartment, my job at the diner, the loneliness that had been my constant companion for 3 weeks. Then I thought about Emma's smile when she'd successfully made cookies, about the way she'd hugged me goodbye. What would Emma say about me coming back? Barrett's laugh was soft, genuine. She's the one who suggested it. She said that maybe you need a family as much as she needs someone who understands what it's like to lose people you love. Out of the mouths of babes. Emma, in her 17-year-old wisdom, had seen something that the adults had missed. We weren't just helping each other, we were healing each other. I'd like that, I said quietly. I'd like to come back. There's one condition. My heart sank. What? No more secrets. If something happens with Hugo, if you hear from him or about him, you tell me. We deal with things as a family, not as individuals trying to protect each other. Agreed. And Marion, I want you to think of this as your home, not as a temporary arrangement. Emma needs stability, and frankly, so do you. Before I could respond, I heard Emma's voice more clearly in the background. Did you ask her? Is she coming home? Home. The word hit me with unexpected force. Barrett's house could be my home, not just a place I was staying temporarily. Tell Emma I'll be there tomorrow, I said, smiling through my tears. After I hung up, I sat in my small apartment looking around at the few possessions I'd accumulated. It wasn't much. Some clothes, a few books, the photos of Hugo from when he was young that I'd carried with me when I left his house. Tomorrow, I'd pack it all up again and go back to Barrett's house. Back to Emma, who needed someone to show her that love didn't have to be perfect to be real. Back to Barrett, who was learning that sometimes family isn't about blood or history, but about choice and commitment. And maybe, someday, Hugo would realize that he had a father who wanted to know him, and a mother who'd never stopped loving him, despite all her mistakes. But even if Hugo never came around, I would still have Emma and Barrett. I would still have a family that chose me, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. For the first time in years, that felt like enough. 6 months later, I was in the kitchen preparing Thanksgiving dinner when the doorbell rang. Emma was upstairs getting ready. She'd invited her friend Sarah over, the first time she'd wanted to see anyone socially since her mother's death. Barrett was in his study, finishing up some work before the holiday. I wiped my hands on my apron and went to answer the door, expecting Sarah or maybe a delivery. Instead, I found myself face to face with Hugo. He looked thinner than when I'd last seen him, his clothes rumpled, his eyes carrying the weight of someone who hadn't been sleeping well. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Mom. His voice was quiet, uncertain. Hugo. I gripped the doorframe to steady myself. How did you know I was here? I've been keeping tabs. I know Barrett came to see me. I know you've been living here. He shifted uncomfortably. I need to talk to you. Part of me wanted to slam the door in his face to protect myself from another round of rejection and anger. But this was my son, and despite everything that had happened between us, I still loved him. Come in, I said, stepping aside. Hugo entered hesitantly, taking in the warm atmosphere of the house, the smell of turkey roasting, the sound of Emma laughing upstairs, the photos on the side table that now included pictures of me with Barrett and Emma. You look good, he said awkwardly. Healthy. Thank you. I led him to the living room, my heart pounding. How have you been? Hugo sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Terrible, if I'm being honest. I've been thinking about what you told me, about Barrett, about everything. I settled into the chair across from him, keeping my distance. And I realized I've been angry at the wrong person. Hugo looked up at me, and I saw tears in his eyes. I've been angry at you for keeping secrets, but I never stopped to think about why you felt like you had to keep them. I held my breath, afraid to hope. I went to see Dad's grave last week. Hugo's voice was shaky. I sat there for hours thinking about how much he loved me, how he never once treated me like I wasn't his son, even if some part of him suspected. Tears were streaming down my face now. He loved you so much, Hugo. That was never a lie, I know. And I know you loved him too. You sacrificed your chance to be with my biological father because you didn't want to hurt Dad. Hugo wiped his eyes. I've been punishing you for being loyal to the man who raised me. You had every right to be angry? No, I didn't. Hugo's voice was firm. I had a right to be hurt, confused, maybe disappointed that you waited so long to tell me. But I didn't have a right to throw you out of my life like you meant nothing to me. The silence that followed was heavy with years of pain and misunderstanding. I miss you, Mom. Hugo's voice broke on the words. I miss having you in my life. I miss being able to call you when I'm scared or confused or just need to hear your voice. I couldn't speak past the lump in my throat. I know I don't deserve it after how I treated you, but I was hoping. I was hoping maybe we could try again. Start over. Before I could respond, Barrett appeared in the doorway. He'd obviously heard voices and come to investigate. When he saw Hugo, his expression was carefully neutral. Hugo. Barrett's voice was polite but distant. I wasn't expecting to see you. Hugo stood up, facing the father he'd rejected months earlier. I came to see Mom, but since you're here, I owe you an apology too. Barrett raised an eyebrow but said nothing. I was angry when you came to my house, angry at Mom for keeping secrets, angry at you for existing, angry at Dad for being dead. Hugo's voice was steady now, more mature than I'd heard it in years. I took it out on you, and that wasn't fair. You didn't know about me any more than I knew about you. No, I didn't. Barrett stepped into the room but kept his distance. But I understand why you were angry. I was angry too. Are you still angry? I mean, Barrett considered the question. I'm disappointed that I missed 37 years of your life. I'm sorry that your mother felt like she couldn't tell me the truth. But angry? Not anymore. Hugo nodded slowly. Would you? Would you be willing to get to know me now? I know it's late, and I know I made a terrible first impression, but I'd like to try. I watched Barrett's face carefully, seeing him weigh his response. Finally, he smiled slightly. I'd like that too. Dad? Emma's voice carried down from upstairs. Is Sarah here? No, sweetheart, but we have another guest. Barrett looked at me. Should I introduce them? The question was loaded with meaning. Was I ready to tell Emma about Hugo, about the complicated family dynamic she was being drawn into? Yes, I said. It's time she knew the whole story. Emma appeared at the top of the stairs, dressed in a simple sweater and jeans that made her look younger than her 17 years. When she saw Hugo, she tilted her head curiously. Emma, there's someone I'd like you to meet. Barrett gestured toward Hugo. This is Hugo Davies, Marion's son. Emma came down the stairs, her eyes moving between Hugo and me. Your son? But I thought. Didn't you say he didn't want to see you anymore? It's complicated, I said gently. Hugo and I had a fight, but we're working things out. Emma studied Hugo for a moment, then surprised everyone by walking straight up to him and extending her hand. I'm Emma Barrett. Marian has been taking care of me since my mom died. Hugo shook her hand, clearly touched by her directness. It's nice to meet you, Emma. I'm sorry about your mother. Thank you. Emma looked at me with a small smile. Marian's been like a mom to me, too. She taught me how to cook and how to talk about sad things without falling apart. The simple statement hit me like a thunderbolt. Emma saw me as a mother figure. This girl who'd lost her mother, who'd been drowning in grief and guilt, had found a way to let me help fill that void in her life. She's good at that, Hugo said quietly. Taking care of people. I forgot that for a while, but I remember now. Barrett cleared his throat. Emma, there's something else you should know about Hugo. Emma looked between Barrett and Hugo, clearly sensing something significant was coming. Hugo is my son too, Barrett said simply, which makes him your half-brother. Emma's eyes widened. Your son? But how is that possible? I took a deep breath. It's a long story, sweetheart. One that involves mistakes I made a long time ago. But the short version is that Hugo is Barrett's son, and I never told either of them about each other until recently. Emma processed this information with the resilience I'd come to admire in her. So Marian is kind of like Hugo's mom and my stepmom, and Hugo is kind of like my stepbrother. Something like that, Barrett said with a smile. Emma grinned. Cool. I always wanted a big brother. Hugo laughed, the first genuine laugh I'd heard from him in years. Well, I've never had a little sister. This should be interesting. The doorbell rang again, and this time it really was Sarah. As Emma introduced her friend to her new family, I felt something settle into place in my chest. This wasn't the family I'd been born into, or even the one I'd married into. This was the family we'd chosen, built from love and forgiveness and the willingness to start over. Later that evening, after Sarah had gone home and Emma had gone to bed, the three of us sat around the kitchen table with cups of coffee and leftover pie. I have something to tell you both, Hugo said, his voice nervous but determined. I've been thinking about what I want to do with my life, about the kind of person I want to be. Barrett and I waited. I want to go back to school, finish my degree. Hugo looked at Barrett. I was wondering if you'd be willing to help me with that. Not just financially, but I'd like to get to know you while I figure out what I want to study. Barrett's smile was warm, genuine. I'd be honored to help. And Mom, Hugo turned to me. I was hoping you'd help me figure out how to be a better man, the kind of man Dad would have been proud of. I reached across the table and took his hand. David was always proud of you, Hugo, even when you couldn't see it. I know that now. Hugo squeezed my hand. I just want to make sure I don't waste any more time being angry about things I can't change. As we sat there talking about the future, about Hugo's plans for school, about Emma's college applications, about the Thanksgiving traditions we wanted to start as a family, I thought about the woman who'd been living under a bridge 6 months ago. That woman had been carrying the weight of 37 years of secrets. She'd been rejected by her son, had no home, no family, no hope for the future. Now I was surrounded by people who chose to love me despite my flaws. Emma, who saw me as a mother figure. Barrett, who'd forgiven my past mistakes and offered me a future. And Hugo, who'd found his way back to me and was ready to build something new. I'd spent so many years believing that family was about blood and obligation. But this family we'd created was about something deeper than that. It was about choosing to show up for each other, even when it was hard. It was about forgiveness and second chances and the courage to love imperfectly. As I looked around the table at these three people who'd become my world, I realized something important. I'd thought I was rescuing Emma, helping her heal from her mother's death. I'd thought Barrett was rescuing me from homelessness and despair. But the truth was, we'd all rescued each other. What are you thinking about? Barrett asked, noticing my distant expression. I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in years. I'm thinking about how grateful I am, for second chances, for forgiveness, for family that chooses to love you. Emma reached over and squeezed my other hand. We're grateful for you too. All of us. Hugo nodded in agreement. I know I gave you every reason to give up on me, but you never did. Even when I gave up on myself. That's what mothers do, I said simply. We love our children, even when they make it difficult. Even when we make mistakes ourselves. Barrett raised his coffee cup. To family. Not the one we were born into, but the one we choose to create. We toasted with our coffee cups, laughing at the informality of it. But it felt right. Sitting around that kitchen table where Emma and I had baked so many cookies, where Barrett and I had learned to trust each other again, where Hugo was learning to be part of something bigger than his own pain. Outside, it was starting to snow, the first snowfall of the season. But inside, we were warm and safe and surrounded by love that had been tested and proven strong enough to last. I was 62 years old, and I was finally home. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.